Better? Oh, so much better. All right. Let's talk about feature flags. All right. So my name is Rubin. The title of my talk is Intentional Deployment, Best Practices for Feature Flag Management. And I know what you guys are thinking, which is amazing job, Caitlin, on the title, right? It's so good. But what does it actually mean? So let's talk about like the smallest unit of meaning that we can get out of it, which is intention, right? So doing what you meant to do. As software engineers, I hope we are usually coding with intention. I don't know if a lot of you are just slamming your keyboards against your standing desk and just hoping Python spews out, but I'm usually not. No, we are writing code, we're testing code, and we are reviewing code, and we're doing a lot of things to make sure that the code that we write does what we want it to do once it gets out into the world. And then we think to ourselves, maybe we want to be intentional about that step as well, right? So we want to be intentional when we deploy our code out into the world. So not everybody has, continuous integration, continuous deployment, canary deployment. So what is a very easy way to make sure that we have some control over our code once it gets out into the world? That's where we talk about feature flags, right? So if we don't know what a feature flag is, it's basically a light switch that you can wrap your code in. And the important thing is that you can turn it on and off in production without a code deploy. So basically, very fancy if statement. So we're saying if the feature flag is on, we're doing something. Otherwise, we're going to do something else. Everybody with me? Cool. OK, so let's take a look at what that process looks like. So we have, don't know if you guys can see that. So we have a feature flag. We have your brand new code that you wrote called do new thing wrapped behind it. And if the feature flag is on, we're going to do the new thing. Otherwise, we're going to do the old thing that was already there. So took our code, put it behind a feature flag. Now we're going to take that code and we're going to put it in production. So right now the code is in production and the feature flag is off. So we are still doing the old thing. We come over here. We're going to pretend that this feature flag is a release toggle. We turn it on and we roll it all the way out to 100%. Now all of a sudden your users are seeing your feature. Everybody is happy. We're doing the new thing. All of a sudden something goes wrong, right? Your feature is tanking, it's broken, nobody likes it, it sucks, and we want to turn it off. So we can do that immediately. We just come over here, we turn the release toggle back off, and all of a sudden nobody's seeing your feature anymore. So pretty great. Everybody's super happy, you did an amazing job. The issue is that everybody else in your company also had that same amazing idea, right? So when feature flag becomes feature flags, we start to get into a little bit of a mess. And it's not only the fact that we have like such a sheer number of feature flags, but also they all have very different types and very different meanings and rules that apply to them. So your feature flag from before was a release toggle, right? You were slowly rolling something out to a group of users. This one over here is a kill switch, so it's intended to turn something off in production. Meanwhile, this one over here is an experiment, so you're targeting two different groups of users and you're trying to give them a different experience. This one down here is an opt-in, so people who have this feature flag turned on are opting into an experience, but this one over here is an opt-out, so they have the exact opposite situation. So all of these are coming together to give you this one big mess of feature flags, and nobody really has a lot of control or visibility over it. So how do we fix that? Or rather, the question that we want to answer today is, what's the best way to do feature flags? Now let's talk about me a little bit. So why do I want to answer that question? Well, I am a software engineer. I work for a company called Optimizely. And Optimizely is an experimentation platform, which is kind of irrelevant for this, except for the fact that we have a feature flagging product. So I work on a feature flagging product. I use feature flags in development. I hack on feature flags. And I also talk to a lot of people who use feature flags, who develop feature flags, and who try to sell and implement feature flags for other customers. So just for this presentation, I spoke to a lot of people. Spoke to some back-end software engineers, some front-end software engineers, some SDK engineers, some PMs, director of development, a sales engineer, a solutions architect, a DevOps engineer or two, and a quality assurance engineer. And all of these people and I have been trying to come up with, what is the best way to do feature flags. So we want to talk about what the best way to do feature flags is, but it's kind of more fun to talk about the wrong way to do feature flags. So what are the risks that we associate with putting feature flags in our code? So we've talked about some people, we've talked about some feature flags. What happens when we put those two things together? The first thing we can talk about is probably like the lowest risk scenario, right? So what's the lowest risk that we can do from feature flags? Putting a feature flag in your code base is inherently introducing tech debt into your code base. So if we take a look at these two code snippets from before, the one on the left is 4 times as long, obviously, so it's a little bit harder to read. But even all the smart people in this room can really not tell me what the thing on the left is doing, right? We don't know the state of the feature flag, so nobody in this room can tell me what it's going to do. Meanwhile, the code snippet on the right, everybody knows it's going to do the new thing. Great. So we are increasing the complexity in tech debt and making it harder for our engineers to understand the code. And not only that, so I took like a look at in our own code base to find some feature flags, and I found we have over 65 instances of feature flags being called, and a lot of those are gating like thousands of lines of code, right? So this is a pretty big issue. Not only that, but taking out a feature kind of sucks. So this is an actual feature that I worked on. The PR just to take the feature out was over 1,000 lines of code, generated 95 plus comments on GitHub, and it lived in the code base for over 60 days. So that's kind of a mess. So we've talked about the lower risk scenario. We are not really affecting any customers with this risk. We're just kind of pissing off a bunch of engineers. Now let's talk about something that's a little bit more high risk, right? We're actually affecting customers. So we have to think about the performance impacts on our system that we have when we put feature flags in. What happens when your feature is broken, or your feature tanks, nobody likes it, or your feature is improperly implemented? We can actually look at an example of this from my own company. So we had, if you look at this code sample, this is actually how you instantiate and use a feature flag. You're just kind of importing the package, you're instantiating the client, which is just like grabbing a data file from somewhere and setting it up. Those first 2 lines are more just setup. They should only happen once. And then that second part is where you're actually calling if the feature is enabled or not. So we would think that this second part is the part that you should be able to repeat over and over and over again. Everything's fine. Everyone's happy. What we actually did was we put the whole thing in a loop. So we were instantiating the client. We were doing all this expensive stuff a lot of times. Is that actually an issue? So it turns out that added a performance hit of 48 seconds to one of our API endpoints. I don't know how patient the people in the room are, but I don't think anybody wants to wait 48 seconds for any kind of answer. So these things can have real performance impacts on your system if you're not doing them correctly. So everybody's thinking, like, how bad can feature flags actually get? Is this actually a high-risk scenario, right? How bad can it get? It turns out it can get pretty bad. So has anybody heard of Knight Capital Group? Yeah, some people are nodding. They were a financial services group. The keyword here is were. So they were the largest trader in US equities in 2012. They were trading $21 billion every day. It's a lot of money. At 9:30 a.m. on August 1st, 2012, they had $365 million, right? Pay attention to that time. I'm not just noting it for fun. By 10:15 a.m., they were completely bankrupt. They had a $460 million loss. So that was 45 minutes completely bankrupt. Why was that? Because of an improperly managed feature flag. So what happened was they had some 8-year-plus old code on a server. It was gated behind a feature flag that was currently off. So everybody was happy. It was still doing whatever it was supposed to do. None of this code was getting touched. They had this brand new code that they added behind the same feature flag. So now the feature flag gets turned on. We're reviving the old code from the dead by accident. This is 8-year-old code. What does that code actually do? Turns out it's responsible for processing orders. So they are a trading company. It's responsible for getting orders as a parent and just sending out child orders. It did not have the validation to stop processing orders. So for 45 minutes, it was nonstop processing orders, ended up realizing a $460 million loss in 45 minutes. If you want a nice visual of what that looks like, this is the stock over the course of those days. Yeah, so it can actually end up being pretty bad. So everybody's terrified now. We're using feature flags. We're going to go under in 45 minutes, right? No, because we came to this talk. We're all going to be intentional about how we deploy with feature flags, right? So we're going to think about mitigating these risks by being intentional about using feature flags. Because when it comes down to it, you used a feature flag in the first place because you wanted to be intentional when you wrote your code. So why are we not being intentional about controlling those flags once they're in production? So let's talk about best practices, right? These might look different for your companies, your specific implementation of feature flags, but these are all some questions that you should be thinking about and answering before you put them into your code base. And the two words that we want to focus on are visibility and accountability. So let's talk about visibility first. Basically, I want you to know where your flags are and what they're doing every single hour of every day. Basically, I want you to stalk your flags. I want you to be a helicopter parent all over your flags, and for every single flag, you should know the state, the history, the metrics, and the expiration. So let's go through these words. So state's pretty simple. We talked about before. Your feature flags are like a light switch. Is it on or off? History is probably going to be a little bit more specific to your implementation, but these are some questions that you might want to think about, right? So for every single flag, when did it last change? Why did it change? Who changed it? And then for every single change that's happened, what was the state? What was the rollout percentage? What was the audience that it was targeting? These are all questions that you want to think to yourself when you're putting feature flags in. The next thing you want to think about is some metrics. So what metrics are around this feature flag? What are tracking, is it actually being used? So how many times has this flag been evaluated? And when was the last time it was evaluated? And then the last thing you want to know with metrics are kind of what's tracking its success or its failure. Is the feature flag succeeding? For every flag, you also want to know an expiration date. So a super important thing with feature flags is that you should be knowing when it goes into your code, when it's coming back out. So for every single flag, when does the flag need to be removed and who's responsible for taking it out? So we talked about some things that you want to know per feature flag. Now we can talk about kind of a bird's eye view of your entire system. So at any given time, you should be able to answer for me how many flags are in your code base, where are they in your code, and what percentage of your flags are rolled out to a certain percentage, right? So how many have been rolled out all the way to 100, how many haven't been rolled out at all or have been rolled back to 0, and then which flags are expired or which flags are expiring in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Very important for planning. The next thing we want to think about is collaboration, right? So other people might be using your flag, not necessarily in kind of the disastrous way of Knight Capital Group, but the beauty of feature flags is that they can turn what used to be a code deploy into a business decision. And the important thing to note with that is that you might not be the one flipping the switch on your feature flag. So we need to think about who else your feature flag can affect, right? What else might need to be gated behind this flag? Are there docs? Is there marketing material that needs to be gated based on the same flag? Who's controlling the flag, right? Is it going to be a developer? Is it a release team? Is it PM? And then we also want to know who needs to be notified of this change. Your flag is going to affect other people. Who needs to be notified that it's going out? So there's a pretty low-tech way of doing this, which is you can find your flags with git grep. A couple examples here. You can track your flags in a Google document or a shared spreadsheet. This is a section that I added to a technical design document. But the important thing is that we're answering the same question, right? Where are flags? How many of them are there? What's the rollout schedule? What's the flag history? You just want to make sure that you're getting all of these questions before you start rolling out with flags. If you're working on a feature flag solution like I do, or if you're using something in-house, building something, you can make something that's maybe a little bit more customized. This is like a dashboard that I built. So where is the flag? Is it being used? When does it expire? We're doing it in a little bit more of an automatic way, but we're answering the same questions. Cool. So we talked about visibility. Now we all have a very highly visible feature flagging system. Now we want to be accountable for that system. So we want to be accountable for our feature flags. For every single flag, you should make sure that it's tracked in a shared place, that everybody who's a stakeholder in this flags has access to the information, and that you have alerting set up on the monitoring metrics you set up for visibility. So how do we do this? It's basically a lot of procedural change. So you want to decide as a team or as a company who owns managing your feature flags, who's in charge of making sure that this program is running smoothly. Is it a release team? Is it a PM? Is it an engineering manager? And then a separate question could be who owns releasing the features. So is it a release team? Is it a PM? Is it an engineering manager? Or is it the engineers themselves? The person who is managing the program and the person who's actually releasing the flags can be a separate person. And then for the person who's managing releasing your flags, what are you responsible for giving them? You should probably be giving them a release process, an exit criteria, and some comms, right? So let's go through the 3 of those. So for a release process, you want to be giving them a rollout plan when you give them the feature flag. So who is rolling out what at any given time is an answer that the person who's rolling out your flag should know the answer to. The next thing you want to think about is, some risk assessment. So who are you targeting with your flag? And then what's the rollback procedure? And by rollback procedure, I mean, there's a lot of little issues or bugs that they could find with the feature. What's actually responsible for a rollback? What's big enough that it's risky enough that they need to roll it back? And then who's responsible for rolling back that flag? The next thing we can talk about is exit criteria. So this is kind of a contract between product development that determines what's the success of the feature flag and when can it be removed from the code base. That's something that you should be giving the rollout team. And then the last thing you want to think about is communication, right? So like we talked about before, who needs to know that this flag is on? What support staff needs to know? And then how do they bucket themselves in and out of the feature? You should be giving them that information. So we talked about a lot of things that you should be paying attention to. How do we kind of enforce that in our organization? So one way that you can think about it is having a WIP limit. So having a work in progress limit on the number of features or feature flags that you have in development. This is something that you can decide as a company. You want to consider feature flags as work in flight, right? So how much work in flight do you want to have as a team or as a company? And this is super important because the people that are feeling the consequences of this tech debt are not always the people prioritizing the work to take it out. So having a work in progress limit might help you in that area. The next thing you might want to think about is having a feature flag checklist, right? So what are the lists of must-dos before somebody implements a feature? You can decide that as a company. What tracking do they need? What's the procedure that they need to follow? How do they roll forward? How do they roll back? And what kind of changes should not be behind a feature flag? So if you have destructive database changes or things like that, these are things that shouldn't live behind a feature flag, and you should know that for your company. The next thing you might want to decide as a company is, what's the lifespan of a specific kind of feature flag? So for short-lived flags, maybe it's a day for you, maybe it's a week, maybe it's a month, and do you want to have long-lived flags at all? These are questions that you should be thinking about, and then even if somebody wants to break these rules, they have to think about it, they have to have a reason for doing that. When you're thinking about these limits, I would say that it depends on basically how long does your system take to get meaningful results. So, for your company, if your feature is getting a lot of traffic, it might take you like a minute, a day, an hour to get meaningful results. It might take you a lot longer, but these are the things that you want to think about. So we want to talk about expired features as well. How do we make sure that we take these out of the code base? So we want to prioritize removing features as a part of the work of the feature. We want to retire feature flags which are expired or unused. And we want to make sure that those get out of the code base as soon as possible. How do we make sure that expired features are removed? There's a lot of ways that you could do this, but a couple ideas is you could have a feature stand-up every week where you make sure that you're looking at those things we tracked in visibility, and you're making sure that we're getting out expired features, unused features, and features that need to go. We can also ticket flag removal when the flag is created. If you guys use Jira or something and you're ticketing your project out, just write a ticket to take the flag out when you're putting it in. The most extreme version of this is you can literally write the PR to take the flag out as soon as you put it in. That might work for you guys, it might not, but it's still an idea. All right, and the last thing to note is that these are procedural changes, right? So with any procedural change, it's super important that you ensure review from all the people who have a stake in this process, you gain buy-in from your community, and you communicate these standards widely. Some other tips, these might work for you, they might not. They're kind of like a rule of thumb though. You wanna keep your features as small as possible. As short-lived as possible, so they should live in the code base for as little of time as possible, and they should be kind of as top level as possible. And what I mean by that is that you should try to bubble them up in your code to the highest point possible. That just makes it a little bit easier for you when you're testing. You don't have a lot of various scenarios when you have a lot of branches at the bottom, you just have one branch at the top of the chain. So these are all the things that I've talked about. If we kind of bring it back to the risks that we spoke about before, and we want to talk about tech debt. So which of these things could have mitigated tech debt in your code? If you had, expiration, metrics, some procedure, some very small short-lived flags, all of these things would get tech debt out of your code base. If we want to talk about the more, middling risks, if we had some metrics, alerting, and a little bit of procedure on that implementation of a feature flag that added, 48 seconds to one of our endpoints, we could have mitigated that risk. And then if we want to talk about the total disaster scenario, these are the things that would have prevented that total disaster from happening. So in summary, we're all going to manage our feature flags. Otherwise, bad things can happen. We're going to follow the best practices of visibility. So everybody's going to go home. We're all going to stock our flags. And we're going to have a lot of accountability, right? So we're going to monitor and alert on the metrics that we set up and retire the flags when they need to go. And with that, we are all going to go from this giant mess of feature flags that we saw before to a nicely organized feature flagging solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cool. I can take some questions. And also, if you want to try feature flags, there's a link there. Optimizely has a free feature flagging product. You can try it out.
If there are any questions, please stand at the microphones in the middle. Yep.
Is this on? Okay, cool. So I was looking at a feature flag that we had the other week, and it had been there for like 2 years at 0%, but it was also like enabled for like 20 clients. So I guess this feature was like fixing something for these people, but it was decided that we weren't going to roll this out. So like this is like I guess this is a common abuse of feature flags, but like that means I can't take it out now. So have you seen things like that, and do you have any tips on how to deal with it?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely have experience with like, you'll work out a short-term solution to something that you gate behind a feature flag and target maybe a large customer or something. The important thing there is that you need to convince, your PMs or whoever's making the decision that you need to prioritize the work to actually fix it. It's really the only thing that can come out of it.
Could you talk excuse me? Could you talk a little bit about writing your tests with the feature flags? If there are a whole number of them, how can you keep your code clean?
Yeah, that's why it's super hard. The only thing I would say for that is that's where it's important to kind of bubble up your feature flags. So keep them at the highest possible level that you can in your code base. But it is hard to test with feature flags and to test them on and off and all of the various combinations. That's something that you kind of have to work out with your QI teams or just write tests for. I've seen people kind of write comments and just like block out lines of feature flag tests and make it easier to take them out later. Yeah, it's a difficult problem.
I was wondering if you might be able to dig into some details, and I feel like this is probably a loaded question, but like implementation details of kind of like different feature flag architectures for like client and server, and like what you found that works best.
So yeah, besides like this kind of rules of thumb that I talked about, it's probably more based on like your specific architecture and like how you want to use them as a team. I guess if you could make your question a little bit more specific.
So like one case I have in mind that we have at my company is we store our feature flags in a database, and you can attach make user groups for which the feature flag is on and off. But we use the same feature flag for our client and our server. So we send a REST API request to our server to get whether the feature flag is on or off. But that means that, of course, you can't write any client code that is dependent on said feature flag before you actually send the API request to the server to get whether the feature flag is on or off. And that also means that when the user is logged out, you can't use the said feature flag. So I was wondering, like, client-side feature flags, implementations?
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I think we use kind of the same implementation where you're making a request, but that's where kind of our specific implementation, you do that kind of instantiation step that I had before, that setup, and then it's able to make a decision on whether the user is bucketed or not without making an API request.
Okay, interesting.
So,
yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I think we have a situation where feature flags and permissions are kind of bumping up against each other, where we have certain groups of users and we will give them access to something via feature flags. And I'm wondering, yeah, if you have any thoughts on best practices there, how you kind of decide whether something is a feature flag thing or a permissions thing.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely do use feature flags with permission gating. So I think it's possible that that can be a pattern for you. I think then it becomes really important to have all of this procedure around feature flags. Because whether it's kind of built into your code base or whether you're controlling it with feature flags, it's kind of doing the same thing in different ways, right? So it's just more important that you know the procedure that's outlining this process. I don't know if you have more specific.
Helpful, just
Okay.
think about the procedures for it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
for sure.
Hi, so at my company, we tend to name our experiments like with like the platform and then the team name and then whatever feature name that we just want to put. So that kind of prevents other teams or other people from reusing our feature flags because it's kind of contained in our team. Is that something you guys do at Optimizely, or is there like a stricter like permission skating you guys do to prevent feature flag overuse?
Yeah, I mean, naming conventions are totally a fine way to prevent feature flag overuse. I think having those controls built into your system is obviously safer, but not everybody has that, right? So naming conventions can be a good middle step. I would say try to build in these procedures into your platform if possible.
Cool, thanks.
How do you typically implement the turning on and off of the feature switch, like API endpoints or file system semaphores or?
Yeah, so we have an API that you can turn a feature on and off with. We also have like a UI. That's what I showed in the examples, the actual turning it on and off. I know some people do it with like configuration files. It's just, there's some different ways of doing it.
And I think we have time for one last question.
Heard at least I think Etsy at some talk, they kind of use feature flags to drive their single branch development as a way of, I mean, you know, because branches are just versions of the code base and feature flags are, you know, the code that implements them, and then the data that says what state each one is in that's a bunch of different versions of the code base as well. It looked like you are still using some form of branching as well as feature flags, and I wondered if you had noodled through, because I haven't, really the implications of using branches and feature flags and like that level of complexity in managing it.
Yeah. So I guess like what constitutes, you're talking about like chunk-based development, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I've heard a couple different things on like what makes something chunk-based development. I would say we definitely have branches that are open for longer than a day or longer than a week. We try to merge those into, you know, production as soon as possible. But sorry, the question was like, how do you manage
I mean, I guess
feature
a good
flags
way
and
to say
branching?
this would be, do you merge unfinished feature, like feature flag wrapped chunks of code? Like in your mainline branch, do you have feature flags that are turned off that house code that just would not work or is broken, or a feature that's incomplete?
Yeah.
Or do you make sure, okay.
Yeah, so the important thing to make sure in that case is that like the fail state when the feature flag is off is safe. But yeah, we've done that before where we merge parts of features so that you don't have like 2,000 line branches.
Right, so if you have like a multi-PR feature that you need to get, you know, someone's still working on the second part, you might merge the first part or something and keep it wrapped in a safe flag like that, is what you're saying, something like that?
Yeah, we've done some variant of that before.
Thank you very much, Caitlin.
Cool, thank you.